Hi, I'm Dr. Katie Percival, and I'm a child-centered play therapist. I've spent most of my professional life learning to lean into this philosophy of child-centered play therapy and this way of being with clients. And today I want to talk about the skill that we call tracking or reflecting nonverbal behavior. Usually, this is the first skill that we teach, and I think a lot of times people take it for granted as being easy to learn and not as helpful as some of the other skills. But I do think when it's used in the context of a CCPT philosophy, which we'll discuss more in a minute, it can be really critical and a really great tool for us to communicate the things that we want to communicate to children and creating that safe and growth producing environment for them. So, what is this skill, tracking or reflecting nonverbal verbal behavior? Basically, it's just stating what the child is doing. So, some examples could be you're moving that one over there, you're using that one's moving really quickly, you're painting the top part with big movements. So, we're just stating what the child is doing in a way that shows them that we're there with them. When I teach this skill, adults often have a negative reaction because I think it can feel invasive or like you're being watched. And this is especially true if it's being applied in a rote or a disconnected way, which, as we're learning, sometimes we do apply it in that way. So it's important that we utilize this skill in the CCPT framework, which includes Rogers' 6 conditions for personality change, as well as the 19 propositions. Right now, I mostly want to focus on how tracking can be used to facilitate 4 of Rogers' 6 conditions for personality change. So we'll talk about those. So the first one that I think tracking is really helpful for is establishing and maintaining psychological contact. So for example, if a child is working on an art project with their back to the therapist, there's probably not a lot of psychological contact going on in that moment, or there might not be. And so that can be a time when tracking can really help to facilitate that psychological contact. Also, stating what the child is doing can help communicate the therapist's understanding of the client's experience. So, this empathic understanding. For example, if I say those are fighting, or that one has a lot to say, maybe it's a puppet who's whispering furiously in the other puppet's ear. And I just say, oh, that one has a lot to say. And that can communicate that I'm in their world with them and I'm really working to understand the way that they view the world. So of course, there's many other ways that we can communicate that, but tracking is a really important tool in doing that. And then there are two main ways that tracking behavior can help us communicate unconditional and positive regard. So if I say you're kicking that when a child is maybe gently kicking a bot bag, that seems pretty simple and easy, right? But actually, this can help the child feel that this what would be in that case an appropriate release of whether it's energy or anger or some other feeling toward the bot they're expressing that toward the bot bag. It can help them feel that that expression is accepted, and then it may result in even more expression of that feeling. So maybe later in the session or in the next session they really start to beat up the bot bag and get some of those that energy or those big feelings out, or they start to express their anger in a different way, maybe with some other toys because they felt accepted when I just made that simple statement, you're kicking that in an accepting way. Another way that unconditional positive regard can be communicated using tracking statements is to make sure that I'm calmly reflecting both the behaviors that the child considers positive and those that the child considers more negative. So, using the same example of kicking the bag, let's say a child is doing that, but then they also are feeding the baby. Um, I want to make sure that I'm acknowledging both of those behaviors rather than maybe just the nurturing behavior, because that might communicate that the nurturing behavior is more acceptable to me than the more quote unquote aggressive behavior of kicking. So again, making sure that I'm saying, oh, you're feeding the baby, or you're feeding that one, or maybe they've identified as a baby, you're feeding the baby. Oh, and you're kicking that. So I'm equally with the same kind of affect, responding to both of those behaviors. In that way, I'm not inadvertently communicating that I value one behavior over And then finally, Roger's condition of congruence, I think, is particularly relevant when we talk about tracking. It can be really easy for tracking responses or reflecting nonverbal behavior to become rote. You're doing that, you're putting that over there, now you're doing this, right? And these rote responses are, of course, not genuine. And in those cases, when it becomes more rote, they can come across as more awkward or scrutinizing. Which of course we don't want a child to feel scrutinized. Sometimes one way I know this is starting to happen, I might just kind of catch myself of like, oh, I'm not really in this. I'm just kind of responding because I know what to say. Another way though is if a child is saying to me or to, a therapist I'm supervising, like be quiet or why are you talking so weird? Then that can be a sign. It can be, it's not necessarily, but it can be a sign that the therapist is disconnected and they're just kind of using these tracking responses in a less than therapeutic way because they're not congruent and then they're not really in there with the child. They're not communicating that empathic understanding or that unconditional positive regard with their responses. They're just kind of saying it because they think that's what they're supposed to say. And so in these cases, I might want to check in with myself of, okay, am I really connected here or am I just using these in a rote way? There are a few developmental considerations that I like to think about when we talk about tracking responses. So pre-operational children, so that would be like preschool and early school age kids, they often respond really well to more frequent tracking or reflection of nonverbal behavior because they are egocentric at this stage, which means they kind of tend to think that everyone experiences the world as they do. So it doesn't really bother them if you're saying what they're doing because they're like, of course you're in this with me, right? However, when we get into more the age of preteens and teens, so like 10, 11, and up, they might be more likely to interpret these kinds of responses as scrutiny of their behavior because they already are starting to develop that sense that everyone's watching them and people are judging them all the time. So we want to be a lot more considerate of how we use the tracking responses, tracking behavior with these older kids, like the 10, 11, 12 year olds. They can still be useful for sure, but we just want to make sure we're using them sparingly and we're not coming across as if we're evaluating them or scrutinizing them. So this has been a quick introduction to tracking. Hopefully it gave you some new things to think about. I definitely think tracking is not just a basic skill. It's critical for building the relationship, for communicating empathy, for communicating unconditional positive regard. So hopefully this class felt helpful in either you starting to use it or using it in some new ways.